how can I bring the knowledge and the resources that I acquire here to my community? Regardless of the seat that we're in, there's something that we can do. And it's really just the responsibility is on us to ask ourselves that question and come up with an answer and actually take action around it.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the show Dr. Rachel Laryea.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hello. First of all, we love the butter yellow moment, okay? It's a trend. She didn't even know it's trending, and she's here in style, on fashion, okay? We literally love that. So just a quick warm up here. Let's start with a quick rewind. So you initially were on Wall Street. Okay, what drew you to Wall Street, and how did that journey lead you to like anthropology and like a culture-based entrepreneurship track?
Yeah. So I had no idea that I would end up in finance. I think I was perhaps the least likely person to even think of myself on Wall Street. It was the case, I did my undergrad at NYU, and I really thought I was going to go to grad school. I thought that was my next step. But kind of randomly, I got recruited to work at Goldman Sachs. And I was a junior at the time, and I had no context for it. They wanted me to come to a sales and trading insight day as part of the recruitment process. And I didn't really give it that much attention, but it was really my older brother who was in college at the time and was finishing up. And he said, you should actually consider this because it could be hugely influential for like your future and changing the trajectory of your career. And so I said, all right. So I go to the Insight Day and I have no idea what they're talking about. They're talking about securities, different assets, how you trade and sell, all of that. And I just remember thinking to myself, if I can get through the day, I'll count it a win. I don't even need to, go through this recruitment process successfully. I just felt such like a fish out of water. And not to mention all the people at the recruiting day, they were all kind of finance, econ majors. And I was a social and cultural analysis major. And so much of that discipline is focused on critical thinking and how you think about how culture and societies are sustained. So totally different than the kind of business school, business mindset that so many of these other students at the recruitment day kind of just were trained in. And so I thought, I showed up, I gave myself kind of that moment, but I wasn't thinking too much of it. But then they came back, they being Goldman, and said, okay, we want to continue interviewing you. And at that time, they had these super days where you'd spend a whole day interviewing a whole bunch of different people who work at the organization. It was like hours worth of interviewing. You would do these rotations with two Goldman Sachs employees for maybe half hour, and then you just rotate. And I made it through that, ultimately, got the internship and then the full-time offer. And one of the folks who interviewed me, who became a great mentor of mine, I was asking him, why did you guys hire me? Because by definition, it didn't make sense to hire me. And he told me, well, you ask really good questions. And we really felt like the level of critical thinking is really important, regardless of if you have a finance or econ background. It's more so important if you're curious and you'll interrogate the kind of spaces you're in, the processes that you see as a way to enhance the institution. So that's why I got the role, because I asked questions. And it was definitely a culture shock for me because, as I said, I had no one in my family who came from high finance or econ or anything like that. Even my brother, he was a philosophy major. He just happened to have some sense around, Wall Street and finance and the opportunities it might create. And so I definitely felt imposter syndrome, and that, especially in the internship, because, a lot of these shows, whether it be like Industry, Succession, or Billions, they show the level of stress and anxiety. And also when you're an intern, it's like all this pressure to get the full-time offer. It's not just about having a 10-week experience to see if finance is for you, but trying to compete against others to be most visible to senior leaders to get that kind of full-time offer at the end. So there's a lot of that kind of informing my experience as well, on top of being one of the few Black people, Black women in the division that I was in, and wrestling with all of that at the same time. But it also, I think, showed me how, for the first time, Black professionals were both critical of an economic system, being capitalism, while still using the tools of it to their benefit. And that really ruptured so much of my training in undergrad, which was rooted in kind of critical race theory, the Black radical tradition that had very particular insights around how Black people participate in the economy. And I always felt like those kind of insights were very narrow and reductive at times. And so for me to be at Goldman and see how Black professionals were doing it differently, it was complicated, it was nuanced, it gave me kind of a new perception about how we can exist in capitalism in ways that, again, are nuanced and really in service of us. And so that's what then kind of got me back on the trajectory for grad school. But this time I had a vision for what I wanted to study and how we use the tools of capitalism in service of social good, in service of ourselves, that would really kind of rupture preconceived notions about how Black people should relate to capitalism.
Wow. I am so impressed by you. This is like so many questions. Oh my goodness. Okay. So speaking of that, how do we participate in wealth building without unknowingly becoming gatekeepers or replicators of these oppressive systems? Because oftentimes we see a lot of us get in certain spaces and sometimes we tend to gatekeep ourselves, almost as though, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, we tend to feel like, all right, well, I've earned my keep. You need to struggle just as much to get to where I got or get to where I am.
Yeah. So that's where I realized frameworks and definitions become really important because capitalism as we know it really is kind of underwritten by so much of what you described, that kind of individualism focused on the individual, the self. I've achieved something, you need to be on your own to achieve it as well. It breeds this kind of scarcity mindset that there are finite resources and so every man out for himself. And it breeds this kind of pursuit of profitability over everything else, because capitalism as we know it, as we define it, is really about private ownership to enhance one's sense of profitability and access to monetary capital and access. So what was interesting for me as I was kind of just reconciling, so much of the history, how we often relate to each other, relate to capitalism, but then also was seeing this new thing around, new to me at that time, how Black people were doing it differently. It required me to then create a framework, which is in the title of the book, Black Capitalists, but then also a framework for Black capitalism that really then becomes a contender for the capitalism that we know. So Black capitalism, as I define it, is this kind of pragmatic theory whereby private actors or collectives reposition themselves within the current economic system in order to achieve excess capital, but with the purpose of producing and engendering social good. So that's the core difference. It's not just about profitability. It's also about how can I make sure that my economic thriving is not predicated and dependent upon your exploitation or your harm in any way. And so when you have that framework and you have that set of beliefs that ladder up to that framework and behaviors that ladder up to that, then you get to actually contend with the capitalism that we know, because it's a very different thing to be a Black capitalist as I define it versus being a Black person who participates in capitalism, as you were talking about. And you can reproduce the harms of it and still be a Black person while doing it. So that becomes the core difference that people have to reckon with, because you're right, as different opportunities become available to someone, you kind of climb the corporate ladder or whatever ladder it is, you might have a sense of entitlement that, oh, I had to earn this, so you have to do it as well. That's a capitalist logic. Whereas to have a Black capitalist logic, it's I'm going to kind of advance in a social ladder. I'm going to think about what are the tactics and strategies to do that, and also create a way for you to do it as well. Because it's not about how one person can compete with another. We're all trying to get there.
Right.
And so that becomes the core difference.
I love that so much. Wow. I hope that is resonating with everyone, that there is a difference between a Black person that's participating in capitalism versus what you define as a Black capitalist. I absolutely love that. What would you say, what does ethical ownership look like to you in a capitalist system?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Because especially being an entrepreneur, when you have a Black capitalist framework, the kinds of questions you ask yourself around ownership are different than if you were just participating in capitalism. Because with capitalism, we talk about it's just around profitability. You're squeezing margins. You're thinking about how can I extract the most value out of the people who work for me or my employees, right? Whereas in a Black capitalist framework, it's how can I still be profitable and create a business that's sustainable and scalable in the long term, but also value and prioritize the people who even create the value in the first place for the business. So it's asking questions of how do I create a culture that's not exploitative, that doesn't create harm or reproduce it? How do I ensure that the people that work with me feel valued for their intrinsic value as people, not just for the output that they create and produce? And how do I make sure that I'm in conversation with the people who make up this team that I have? Because those questions are very difficult. And when you're asking folks how they feel, how you can create a culture and an organization that everyone can be proud of, it's not about how you can do work for me and I derive the value from it, but how can we all feel like this is a valuable add to our lives? That conversation can be difficult, and it does require sacrifice, I think, on the part of the entrepreneur. Or, you know, when you think about how do you create opportunities for ownership, it does require sacrifice that if you just had a capitalist logic, it wouldn't. And so it's challenging. I think what I'm offering is not something that's easy per se, but when you do it in community and you really believe that my striving for economic and financial security is not dependent on your exploitation, like I mentioned, but there's also a shared belief that I am as invested in your financial security as you are in mine, then we're on the same page about the sacrifices that we'll both make because they're reciprocal at this point. And so those become the questions and the behaviors that ladder up to how you think about ownership within the context of Black capitalism.
Wow. So your academic background, as we could see, is extremely rich, right? I kind of want to go a little bit backwards here. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing. Like what made Rachel?
Oh my goodness. First and foremost, my mom. She immigrated to the US in the 80s. And, you know, she was very much, the daughter of two entrepreneurs, two successful ones. But she wanted to kind of chase this elusive American dream. She wanted new opportunities for her children. And so she is a hustler. You know, the way she worked 2 jobs, 7 days a week to take care of my brother and I independently. She really had a strong, and still does, a strong work ethic and a deep belief that, and she would say it to us all the time, education is the way out. And at that time, it was a way out of poverty. It was a way out of, you know, circumstances whereby the reality is such that especially when you're a Black and you have limited resources, people will use it as an opportunity to strip you of your dignity.
Yes.
And so for her, it was really teaching her children, you know, in this American context, how you can have the skill set and kind of the foundation and the rootedness inside yourself to withstand racism, classism, sexism, all of these things, while ever still striving to achieve your goals. And she was a great model for this, you know, what she was able to withstand in pursuit of and sacrificing on account of her kids to live the life that I live now, my brother lives now. And so it started there, but she was a tough one. You know, we would wake up at 4:30 every single morning, and she would have my brother and I do chores. We would clean the house top to bottom. The house did not need to be cleaned top to bottom every day, but it was more so about the principle.
I understand.
The work ethic, you know? And she would have us study before school every single morning. And sometimes she would have us do these essays where we might read these like informational pamphlets about nature or society. And she would have us write these essays. And I can remember she would grade them afterwards. And I never got higher than a C on any single one of those essays. But I think she knew that for me, it would like nurture a sense of resilience and persistence in me, where the next time she'd have me do an essay, I'm like, all right, I got to spend this much more time just to like polish it and make sure it's, good. And so that was my childhood. That was my upbringing, and it was interesting too, because I oftentimes grew up and was in spaces of privilege that I never felt like I had authority in them. So for example, my mom, through an affordable housing program, she won a lottery and was able to actually purchase her first home in what was the wealthiest county in Northern Virginia at the time. And so this is, the picturesque white neighborhood that you can think of, like white picket fences, the parent teacher associations, they're like making pies and doing all that kind of stuff. And I'm having this very Ghanaian experience in America in this wealthy white county. And every correlation that I was seeing to wealth was associated with whiteness. And so it made me really question, man, what does Black wealth look like? What would be the cost of that, or the trade-offs? And so when my mom would say education is your way out, it's a way to just open the aperture for the different opportunities that you can have, the different ways in which you can live a thriving life, and what also would be required, because I think she didn't shy away from teaching my brother and I the realities of racism in America, because that was something she could not shield us from, but it was rather, how do you still stay persistent, stay resilient despite all of that? And so that was my upbringing and my childhood.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I am very fascinated by you, your mom. Your mom sounds like an amazing woman.
She is.
Has there ever been a time where you felt like, I want to rebel against this? I don't want to write an essay.
Oh yeah.
When do you feel like you became grateful?
Honestly, it was probably my mid-20s, mid to late 20s.
Yeah.
But now it's like I really have come to appreciate her, and day by day I think it grows.
Yeah.
Because, some things just take time. They take maturity to really see someone and see the sacrifices that they've made, not on account of themselves, but on account of their children, to live different, better lives. And I had no sense of that then, because I didn't have her vision. I didn't know what that was. But now it's like, oh, I see it. Yeah. I get it. Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. So, like I said, your academic background, it's very rich. It's impressive. You were super accomplished, and I really love that, and I admire that so much. How do you translate all of that historical and economic theory into actionable steps for the everyday professional or entrepreneur of color?
Yeah, I think just being an anthropologist really has helped me to take these really heady, almost esoteric ideas and bring them down to what feels accessible, but also very pragmatic. And why that is a key tool that we use in the discipline of anthropology is ethnography, whereby you're spending time with people, you're spending hours interviewing them or doing participant observation, kind of seeing how they live their lives. And so your framework really becomes the evidence by which you've just seen people do what they do every day. Mm-hmm. So I think that gives a sense of hopefulness, but also something to anchor to. That's not just about theory that we can talk about and debate, but here are examples, that we can point to of how people do this thing that I'm offering as a way to rethink and reposition ourselves within the economic system. And I think the beauty of it is, within the book that I've written and the different case studies that I speak to, those are just examples, and it gives us a blueprint, but there's so many ways in which we can practice social good within the economic system that we're in. And so just as Blackness is not a monolith, our expressions within capitalism are also not monolithic. So
Correct.
You can be an entrepreneur and thinking about how you build business culture in an equitable way. You can be a corporate professional and you're thinking about how can I contribute to social good in the seat that I sit in? Because now I work at JP Morgan Chase in wealth management. And I'm always asking myself the question of, how can I bring the knowledge and the resources that I acquire here to my community as well?
Wow.
And so regardless of the seat that we're in, there's something that we can do. And it's really just the responsibility is on us to ask ourselves that question and come up with an answer and actually take action around it.
I love that. Okay, so speaking of your book, which I need that book. I will absolutely be purchasing. So in your up and coming book, what is one chapter or story that you think will most challenge people's assumptions about money or even power?
Oh, excellent question. And I'll say it's a two-part. There's two stories that I think are really powerful in this sense. One, so much of this work required me to, go into the archives and spend time with the work of historians. And while I was doing that, I learned about examples of enslaved persons during legalized slavery in this country who, while slaves, they operated as bondsmen. So what they would do is they would buy back their time from their slave masters and use that time to then pursue different entrepreneurial activities. And so the money that they would collect from, a business that they would pursue, they would spend some of it to pay their slave masters for buying back some of their time. And the excess they would use to pursue in venture capital activities. So much so that some of these bondsmen who also doubled as slaves would acquire enough capital, monetary capital, to buy their own freedom and that of their family members as well. And there are examples of that. You've probably never seen a film that kind of speaks to that story, but that story exists for several people. And so for me, what was so powerful in learning that and different instances of that is you can think about agency and empowerment even within the context of people not even having ownership of their body. But yet we're able to exist and participate in a system of capitalism that they built, but we're not the beneficiaries of, but use the tools of it in such a creative and innovative way to buy back their physical freedom and that of their communities as well. And so that example, if there's no other more powerful story, that for me was so kind of inspirational and hopeful, because you can think about how you still have agency within a context where you don't even own your own body. So how much more the moment that we live in, where more and more financial literacy is becoming democratized. You have more Black millionaires than you've ever had in this country before. So if someone who's enslaved could find ways and means to create opportunity for themselves, create freedom for themselves, and literally buy it, what can we do in this moment together? And so the other side, the other story I'll say that I think was really powerful for me in, creating this work, there's a man, and everyone's anonymized, but his name is Alex, and he identifies as an Ifa priest and very much rooted in African traditional religions, and he works at Goldman Sachs. And by every estimation, people might say like, oh, he's a diverse hire as a Black queer man. But for him, he kind of understands himself and his relationship to even working at Goldman as one who might consider themselves as a spy. And he uses this language where he is in these spaces whereby he's really thinking about how can he kind of take back resources from these spaces and deploy them into his community. How can he use the system in this context, Wall Street, the financial institutions, in service of himself and in service of his community, and to do that in really compelling ways, one of which through a volunteer program at the firm was able to leverage and kind of build thousands of dollars that he was able to channel into community organizations in his hometown. And so you think about different examples where people will say, like, I know who I am. I know these spaces aren't for me because of the racism that informs these spaces and makes them up. But I'm not going to shy away from being in these spaces because I know they also have resources that I can leverage and use for my people. And so you see the history and the present kind of merging in this really beautiful way about how people think about you can be both critical of a system while still use this system for your benefit.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's profound.
Yeah.
That is profound. Wow. Okay, so how do we balance the desire for legacy and generational wealth with the need for justice and equity? Do you think that they can coexist?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I think that we're skilled. We're masters at holding things in tension. We're masters at holding things in contradiction, even. Because the reality is, and I say this all the time, America is a contradiction. Truly. But we navigate it every single day.
That's funny.
And we figure it out. And so for capitalism to be built in such a way where Black people have been the creators of it, but never the beneficiaries of it, and yet we still persist, we live in a capitalist society, and we sit with all the contradictions of it, we navigate it, you know? And so we ever strive for more instances or more systems and structures that are equitable, that are just, while still also pursuing intergenerational wealth and legacy building. All of those things, it's like, you know, a soup that some of it feels contradictory and complicated, but we do it already.
Yeah.
You know, and so much of this offering that I give, you know, through the book and through the different case studies in the book is really kind of focused on how we can call attention to the fact that we sit in contradictions every day, but then also how we can call attention to the fact that these systems require change, and it's going to be on us to create the change. And it's only going to be through community that we actually realize that change. So in this system that we live in that focuses on ownership, yes, wealth generation is part of that narrative for us as we have access to more capital, as I mentioned before, than we've experienced historically. But at the same time, how do you use the tools of capitalism that are going to create more instances of social good? I'll give you an example. There's a man by the name of Wamimu Abbey. He's also someone I write about quite a bit in the book, and he's the co-founder of an organization called eSusu. And so what they do is really focus on creating credit worthiness for people who are renters. And the thinking is, if you can pay your rent on time, you should be considered credit worthy. And especially for their work, they really focus on people who otherwise would be considered financially invisible. These are people who don't have a credit history of any sort. And so what he's able to do is now, starting the business back in 2018, he's become a unicorn business whereby they have a valuation of over $1 billion. And so they create a mechanism and a channel whereby people are able to access credit, which is crucial when you're thinking about wealth generation, private ownership, for people who otherwise would have never had it. And this is a scalable and sustainable business. And so you see examples of how people do this every day. And it's not just about kind of the B2B business to business value, but also and ultimately the value that's being created for people who otherwise might not have had channels to access capital as well.
Wow. And this is why, like, not only who you know, but what you know. The education is so important because honestly, I had no clue that something like that ever existed. Like having these conversations and being around other, you know, successful Black people that are founders and co-founders is so valuable.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's invaluable. Like I just think about the fact that even in my own upbringing, I just see the trajectory of certain people's lives, how different it is based off of what they had access to. And access really is everything. And that's why I am one like you, where I believe in extending, you know, that table and giving someone a ladder up rather than trying to be a gatekeeper of sorts. Yeah. Do you think that there's any truth to, in your journey throughout corporate, feeling like there's a glass ceiling? Because it seems like, I don't want to assume, but it seems like, you know, you were really, really blessed too in your transition into this, you know, field and being able to for that to transcend into it, you know, educating, you know, our people.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, because it feels like some people, their story feels a little bit different. I don't know if it's because they don't know how to go about having certain conversations on bringing certain things to the forefront of, hey, like, how do you negotiate a higher pay? How do I get in these types of positions? How do I extend more opportunities to more people that look like me? I find that certain people, they tend to they find themselves in these blessed positions, but it still feels like there's a ceiling. Like I know people personally that work for financial institutions, and for months and months they were applying to get, internally move up.
Yeah.
And they cannot move up internally.
Yeah.
They literally have to make a decision to switch to another company. What do you do in a scenario like that where you can't even move up and you're kind of pigeonholed where you are?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And I think that especially for Black and brown people in a corporate context, you see the glass ceiling kind of materialize itself because you might have limited access to promotions, you have limited access to different scopes of work that are going to give you the visibility to get promoted in the first place. You're underpaid, you're doing excess work and undercompensated for it. And so you see just the ways in which the system is doing what the system does, especially in disproportionately negatively affecting Black and brown people. But I do think that even in the midst of that, what becomes a useful counter is working in community, especially within those spaces. And I'll give you an example that first starts with theory, but then I give you the pragmatic aspect of it. So years ago, I learned of this theory by scholars Stefano Harvey and Fred Moten. And they came up with this concept called the undercommons. And the undercommons is this space whereby marginalized people come together within an institutional space, and they acknowledge that the institution is not a place of enlightenment. It's a place that you're in, but not of, because of the kind of systemic inequalities that shape that institution. But at the same time, you should not kind of ignore or dismiss the opportunities that exist within that space. And so then it becomes within that undercommon space, everybody has the same objective to share resources, to share opportunities with one another that will then create new material outcomes. And so while they were talking about that theory in the context of an academic institution, I applied it to, and I encourage other people to apply it to all the different institutions that we're a part of. So say being on Wall Street, it is riddled with so many of the kind of ills that we talk about and that glass ceiling that so many of us kind of come up against. But even still, especially for me, my first role at JP Morgan Chase, I really wanted to kind of change teams. I wasn't kind of happy with where I was. And it was around that time that I became aware of this kind of informal group that came together, an example of the Undercommons, and it was called the African Alliance. And it's an organization that has almost 1,000 people nationwide. And what we do is on a monthly basis, we get together on, one of the members' Zooms, and we'll have speakers come in, or we'll just spend time connecting with one another, learning, what part of the bank are you in? What part of the bank are you in? These are the challenges that I'm having. These are some of the solutions I can offer to that. And it was actually, as I was thinking about, I wanted to pivot, I was going to go to another bank, another institution entirely, because I wanted to leave. But I met someone through the African Alliance who said, hey, the firm is a big place. There are other opportunities here. Let me connect you with people on my team. She connected me with a bunch of people on her team. By the time I got to the hiring manager, I got the job. And so you see how when you're in community and trying to address the challenges that come, it opens the aperture for what's possible. Because now I have an awesome team. I love my job, and that only became possible through this undercommon space that existed. And so, yeah, you have those challenges that present the glass ceiling, but it's through community that you're able to navigate and create, strategies together that helps us counter them. And it might not always be a perfect story whereby, you get the resources you need to address it, but it's like, okay, it might not fit here, but I can still, acquire monetary or human capital resources, social capital that'll get me better positioned for that next thing because I'm in community that's helping me get to that next thing. And so I think that becomes the ways in which we can really challenge and push back against these systems that aim to really oppress us,
Wow. I'm constantly just blown away. That story was I think it personally resonated with me because I know someone that's currently being challenged by this, and to just see that, wait a second, you experienced the exact same thing and saw victory. I also have a story I want to tell you off camera too. That's amazing. Okay, so I want to kind of switch gears to talk about faith and values and also liberation. So a lot of my listeners are faith-based and, or values-led, I should say. How can we hold on to our spiritual and cultural values while navigating in these industries that often reward competition over compassion?
Yeah, that's that part. It's hard, but I think it goes back to also how I was raised. My mother is a woman of faith, and she will always testify that God made the difference in her life and also in the lives of her children and her family. And so I was always, it was always clear to me from an early age that faith and getting really rooted in a relationship with God was really important for me. And you mentioned, me being blessed, and 1,000%, I'll say it 1,000 times over, that God has really made the difference in my life. But it's also been the reason why, especially in those difficult moments, it's like I will lean into that more so than the trap, I think, of capitalism, the trap of culture, the kind of dominant culture that we exist in that really focuses on individualism and kind of prioritizing yourself. And so for me, it's how can I show myself love? How can I show the people around me love? And also just stand up for what's right. It's not to say that I'm not strategic about the battles that I take on,
right.
And when I choose to speak up, especially in corporate spaces, but I do. And I think I've learned as I've gotten older, people do value that and that level of authenticity, because you can tell very quickly if someone is swayed by the tides, right? Whatever the flavor of the week is. But people do have a sense of respect for people who will stand for something and not waver on that. And I think that has been, though challenging because of all the different identities that we hold, especially as a Black woman, to do that work and be so strategic in that sense. And it's exhausting, if I'm honest. But I think that's where faith really makes a difference and kind of stands in the gap for me sometimes when I personally don't have it, but I know that God's got me. And time and time again, he always shows up. And so I think for me, that's where I take heart and how faith has made a difference as well.
I love that. I saw a TikTok that said, look for all the ways that God is showing you that he's with you. And I think it really creates such a space for gratitude within us, where it's like, wow, even if it's someone giving you a compliment and maybe you weren't even having the best day. And like, that is just a way that God is showing, wow, like I am still with you, So it really changed the trajectory of days where I might not be feeling in the best mood. And I feel like God is constantly showing me that he's with me as well. What is the difference between success and liberation, and how do we know which one we are really building toward?
Oof. I think success, that can be so relative and so individually defined. And so it almost becomes imperative that we have a communal definition for what success even is to us within the Black community. Is it intergenerational wealth building? Is that success? Or is success, economic security at the kind of Pan-African global level for us? I think so much of the book, and my hope for it too, is around addressing the fact that for so long we've kind of been at a standstill within the Black community, just because we've been debating for so long, where we have different economic identities. Some of us are capitalists, some of us are anti-capitalist, some of us are socialists. We all have different beliefs about how we should be doing this thing called life and how we should be showing up in the economic system that shapes so much of our lives. But we have to get past that point of debate towards unified action. And I think once we start really thinking about unified action and the strategies that's going to allow us to kind of get to a liberatory future, then we start to understand, okay, how do we even define success? is it tied to liberation? Maybe those things are one and the same, but I think part of the issue has been success means different things within the Black community. Liberation means different things. And certainly our ideas about how we're going to achieve either one of those things has been different too. And so I think it starts first with having shared beliefs about what these terms even mean to us and what we want them to mean to us communally, to then, you know, kind of incite the kind of behaviors that will allow us to achieve it. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I really loved how you explained that, because success is arbitrary. And I think the definition definitely changes from when you are achieving the big thing you say you want to achieve, and then when you actually get it, it tends to morph into something else. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I feel like, you know, obviously I'm sure everyone's initial definition of success is tied to financial, you know, comfort, financial abundance even, you know? And then I think once we achieve that, then it becomes more philanthropic. May I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, you know, I was doing a book event a couple of days ago and someone asked me, can you practice Black capitalism after you've already participated in capitalism as a Black person participating in capitalism?
Wait, that's such a good question.
You know, it was like almost like a afterthought. Like, can you then start thinking about social good or philanthropy after you've achieved success? And I mean, the reality is people do it. And so, yeah, it's possible. But what's really important is how you start can really dictate how you continue.
Ooh.
And so if you are, you know, participating in a way where success is predicated on just a kind of capitalist orientation, you do have to ask yourself the question of like, okay, you might have an idea about how you might think about liberation down the line after you've achieved some kind of financial security and abundance. But along the road to that, was there harm? Was there exploitation in that process? And how do you reconcile that? And so that's why I think while a kind of Black capitalist posture and starting with that foundationally can be challenging, because as I mentioned, you're asking yourself questions that you might not have otherwise had to ask yourself.
Yeah.
You know, operating community in a way where you might have just been kind of looking out for yourself. But that's going to create a setup for success that starting in a kind of capitalist posture might not, you know, especially if, you know, you've achieved a level of financial security. And now, because Black capitalism requires sacrifice, to be in community requires a level of sacrifice. It's how can I give in order to also receive? It's not just about always receiving. And so if you're used to maximum profitability, if you're used to not operating in community in that way, the sacrifice seems that much harder. And then you ask yourself, is that something that I really want to do? And it becomes that much harder. And so that's why how you start is really important. And rooting it in community as the beginning is also really important.
I love that you mentioned that too, because we have to also remember we've already gone through so much trauma generationally. We don't need to stomp on each other on the climb up. I do remember in my research also, I think you did something with plantains. Am I correct?
That's right.
I want to really talk about that. So tell us the story about how this whole thing, the genesis of this plantain business that you've created.
Yes. So Kelawele, long before it was the name of my business, it's the name of a popular plantain street food in Ghana. And it's basically ripe plantains. You dice them up, you marinate them in spices, especially ginger, and you fry it to golden perfection. And it's the most delicious thing. And it was something my mom would make for me as a kid. And she would only do it every once in a while. So it was a treat, right? But I loved it. And I tell people it's my plantain love story because over the years, as I grew up, plantains just had more significance to me. So I moved to the city. And, I was definitely a student on a budget, like trying to figure everything out. And I was also transitioning into a plant-based diet at the time. And so plantains became a meat substitute for me, a dairy substitute. So not only were they cultural, it also became kind of a dietary requirement in a lot of ways, and very budget friendly because you can get like 4 for $1, right?
Yeah.
And then fast forward when I started grad school, and we anthropologists, we spent a lot of time thinking about culture. How does culture get created? How does it create identity or ideas around identity? And I had this kind of aha moment thinking about food as a medium to thinking about culture, because I can be West African, the next person can be from the Caribbean, the next person from Latin America. We all eat plantains,
yes,
though we prepare it differently. And so I love that as a way to think about cultural connection, community making. And it was also the case that I'd go to the grocery store and I'd go to like the vegan aisle or the little vegan sections. Usually you don't even get a whole aisle.
Right.
And nothing was resonating with me culturally. And so I wanted to create a business that focused on cultural relevancy, that was familiar, but still innovative. And so in 2018, I started the business, and it was really focused on creating culturally familiar yet innovative plantain-based products that were also plant-based.
Yeah.
So plantain cookies, brownies,
ice cream.
Yes, yes. And so it very much started grassroots. I was doing festivals and pop-ups in the city, and then had a brick and mortar in downtown Brooklyn, had a stand at the Barclays Center, and now it's all e-commerce and wholesale. But when I tell you about those questions I was asking myself as an entrepreneur, like, how do I do this thing differently? Where it's not just about kind of squeezing as much value as I can get from my employees and making them feel like they're not humans, or I don't treat them as humans, or I don't see them as humans. And so that was really important to me from the jump, where I was like, I'm not going to build a business that's predicated exclusively on output and profitability in that sense. But it is challenging for sure. And it does require more of you than just a kind of capitalist orientation.
Wow. Beautiful, beautiful explanation. And I really want to try the plantain ice cream. I'm plant-based myself.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, oh my gosh, I have to try this. Okay. So wrapping this up, what is one belief that you hope listeners walk away questioning after hearing this conversation?
Well, I think when I endeavored to write this book, I knew that it was going to be provocative. A book called Black Capitalist, for some, will have a visceral reaction to that.
Yes.
And for good reason. I think the history of American capitalism, who it has favored, who it has not, very intentionally and strategically has positioned Black people on what I call the wrong side of capitalism. And so it's hard to imagine yourself on the right side of something when all you've known is being on the wrong side of it. And so for me, I think the greatest hope I have is really kind of helping people and gently kind of helping people think about there's more than what I've seen. There's more than what I've experienced, and that it's going to take community in order to really realize that. I think we are a byproduct of our experiences. And so when we're presented with new information, we can either reject it or we can be curious about it. And I think the hope is, how can we stay curious, which then opens the aperture for how we think about ourselves, how we think about our relationship to the economy, because it's really important to remember that we all have agency. We all have choice in the matter. We all have a say in the systems that define our lives. I think for so many, the idea of capitalism and the reality of it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like it's this big system. I'm just a cog in the engine. I have no say and no power. That's not true. Right. And it's often the case people feel most agentic when they're voting. Yeah. And you'll experience that every, few years or every so often. But the reality is we vote every single day, multiple times a day with our wallet, and so for so many Black people, our relationship to capitalism has been one of consumerism, and so we vote with our dollars and where we put our dollars and spend them. And so if we think about that, if we really think about the power that we do have, imagine what can happen if we're in community with one another. When I tell you that story about how people quite literally bought their freedom during a time of legalized slavery, what can we create for ourselves in the moment that we're living in? And so that's why I always want to focus on empowerment and agency, and that we do have a say in how we continue to operate in this system that is done wrong by us 1,000%, but we can have new outcomes even still.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rachel Laryea, thank you so much for coming on Quality Queen Control. I'm going to list all of Dr. Rachel's resources down below, including her book, Black Capitalism. I will have all her socials and everything in the show notes. So make sure that you guys check that out so that you can figure out where to follow Dr. Rachel as well as support her and her book. I know I definitely am going to be supporting because I have to read this book. I'm so curious. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been such fun.
Yes, this was a very enriching conversation. You were truly incredible.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.